Alistair Finch was a man made of tweed and forgotten pages. His existence at Northgate Middle School was a quiet study in beige, a slow fade into the institutional backdrop of cinderblock walls and scuffed linoleum floors. His jackets, always a shade of brown or muted gray, smelled faintly of pipe tobacco he hadn't smoked in 20 years and the decaying sweetness of old books. To the students, he was a relic, a harmless ghost who drifted through the hallways teaching Shakespeare to children who communicated in memes and acronyms. To his colleagues, he was Mr. Finch, the quiet one, the man you nodded to in the staff room but never truly saw. He was dismissed not with malice, but with the casual indifference reserved for things deemed irrelevant. This invisibility was a cloak he had woven for himself over decades, a necessary shield against a world that had once been too loud, too bright, too brutal. But some things could pierce even the thickest shroud. The crisis began not with a bang, but with the clatter of a plastic lunch tray. Leo was the target. A new foster kid, Leo was as quiet as Alistair, but his silence was different. It wasn't the cultivated peace of a man in retreat. It was the tense, coiled silence of a hunted animal. He was a collection of worn-out sneakers, a threadbare backpack, and eyes that never quite met anyone else's. He moved through the school like a ghost of a different sort, one hoping desperately not to be noticed. But in the unforgiving ecosystem of middle school, such a wish was an invitation. Trent, a boy whose burgeoning athletic physique and father's local influence gave him the predatory confidence of a king, had marked Leo as his territory for casual cruelty. Started small, a shoulder check in the crowded hallway, a whispered insult just loud enough to be heard. Today, it was a deliberately outstretched leg in the cacophony of the cafeteria. Leo went down, his meager lunch of a cheese sandwich and a bruised apple scattering across the filthy floor. Laughter erupted, sharp and cruel, from Trent's table. Other students looked, a few snickered, and most looked away, their silence a form of complicity. A teacher on duty blew a whistle half-heartedly, shouting a generic, "Hey, knock it off," before turning her attention back to a conversation. No one helped Leo. No one spoke to Trent. The incident was absorbed into the daily hum of the school, forgotten before the tray was even cleared. But Alistair, sitting alone in his usual corner with a copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, had seen it all. He didn't move. He didn't speak. But behind his thick-rimmed glasses, his pale blue eyes, usually lost in some distant literary landscape, sharpened with a focus that was cold, clear, and utterly present. He saw the flicker of humiliation in Leo's face, the way the boy's shoulders slumped as he gathered his ruined lunch, his movements quick and furtive, as if trying to erase his own existence. In that small, broken figure, Alistair saw a reflection he hadn't confronted in years, and the comfortable beige of his world began to fray at the edges, revealing a flash of something older, something fiercer, something he thought he had long since buried. The conflict, once noticed, was everywhere. Alistair, now attuned to the subtle frequencies of persecution, saw the web Trent had woven around Leo. It was a masterpiece of casual malevolence. In the library, Trent and his friends would occupy the table next to Leo, their whispers just loud enough to be a constant, unnerving hum of insults about his second-hand clothes, his foster status, his very quietness. They called him Ghost Boy and Leech Leo in gym class. A basketball would always find its way to the back of Leo's head, followed by a chorus of insincere apologies. His homework would vanish from his desk, only to reappear, crumpled and torn, in a trash can at the end of the day. Each act was small enough to be deniable, a classic case of boys will be boys. But together they formed a relentless campaign of psychological erosion. Alistair decided to break his long-held code of non-intervention. He approached Principal Thompson, a man whose ambition had polished all his edges into a smooth, frictionless surface. Thompson's office was a shrine to administrative achievement, filled with fundraising plaques and photos of him shaking hands with local politicians. He listened to Alistair's concerns with a patient, practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Alistair," he began, his tone dripping with condescension, "I appreciate you bringing this to my attention, But we have to be realistic. Trent is a spirited boy, a leader. His father, as you know, is the head of the athletic fundraising committee. We can't afford to alienate him over what sounds like a simple personality clash, Alistair pressed, his voice quiet but firm. It is not a personality clash. It is bullying. The boy, Leo, is being systematically tormented. Thompson's smile tightened. We have a zero-tolerance policy on bullying, of course. But we also need proof, Alistair. Hard proof, not just a feeling. These are serious accusations. Are there witnesses willing to come forward? They both knew the answer. The other students were too afraid of Trent, and the other teachers were too busy or too unwilling to see. Thompson leaned back, the picture of reasonable authority. I'll have a word with Trent. A quiet word. But my advice to you is to focus on your lesson plans. Let the system handle it. The dismissal was absolute. Alistair left the office feeling the familiar weight of institutional inertia, a force more powerful than any single act of cruelty. The system wasn't broken. It was designed this way, to protect the powerful and ignore the whispers of the weak. He was alone in this, a man of words in a world that only responded to power and money. He walked back to his classroom, the principal's platitudes echoing in his ears, and understood that if Leo was to have a defender, it would not come from an office or a policy handbook. It would have to come from him. That evening, in the deep quiet of his small, book-lined house, Alistair felt the ghosts of his own past stirring. He wasn't always this quiet man. Decades ago, he had been a father. His son, Michael, had been a boy much like Leo, gentle, artistic, with a soul too sensitive for the world's sharp edges. Michael had been a collector of butterflies and stray thoughts, a boy who preferred drawing in his sketchbook to the rough and tumble of the playground. Alistair, younger and more consumed by his academic career then, had encouraged him to toughen up, to fit in. He had parroted the same careless advice the world always gives to its gentle souls. Then, one gray afternoon, Michael had come home with a torn shirt and a bruised cheek, the light in his eyes dimmed. He had refused to say what happened, retreating into a silence Alistair couldn't penetrate. A week later, Michael was gone, a victim of a hit-and-run driver, but Alistair knew, with a certainty that had haunted every day since, that the boy's spirit had been broken long before his body was. He had failed to protect his own son from the world's casual cruelty. After his wife left, unable to live in a house so full of silence and sorrow, Alistair had retreated. He left his university position and took the job at Northgate, seeking anonymity, a place where he could simply exist without being seen. He had surrounded himself with books, with the ordered, predictable worlds of fiction, as a bulwark against the chaos and pain of reality. He had become Mr. Finch, the tweed-clad ghost, because being a ghost was safer than being a father. Now, watching Leo navigate the same treacherous waters that had drowned his son, Alistair felt the old wound tear open. He looked at the single, faded photograph on his mantelpiece. A smiling boy with Alistair's eyes, holding a jar with a monarch butterfly inside. The promise he had failed to keep to Michael now echoed in the hollows of his heart. He would not fail again. He would not stand by while another gentle soul was extinguished by the carelessness of others. This was not about school policy or a sense of professional duty. It was a penance. It was a vow made to a ghost in a quiet, lonely house. He would stand for this boy regardless of the cost. The pressure reached its breaking point on a Tuesday afternoon, under a sky the color of a fresh bruise. The final bell had rung, and the schoolyard was a swirling eddy of students rushing toward buses and waiting cars. Alistair was at his classroom window, tidying his desk, when he saw the tableau unfold on the basketball court. Trent and his two main lieutenants had cornered Leo against the chain-link fence. There was no pretense of subtlety now. This was a public display of dominance. The usual circle of onlookers formed, a silent, captive audience. Some students pulled out their phones, not to call for help, but to record the spectacle. A few teachers on yard duty were engaged in a conversation near the school gates, their backs conveniently turned to the unfolding drama. It was a perfect conspiracy of silence. Trent started by knocking Leo's backpack to the ground, its contents spilling onto the asphalt. A tattered library book, a half-finished drawing, a single, cheap pencil. Then the shoving began. It wasn't violent enough to be called a fight, but it was aggressive and deeply humiliating. Each shove was punctuated by jeers. "What's wrong, ghost boy? No one coming to save you," Trent taunted, his voice carrying across the yard. "Where's your family? Oh right. You don't have 1 inch." The words were like stones, each one finding its mark. Leo didn't fight back. He simply stood there, his arms crossed over his chest, absorbing the blows and the insults, his face a pale, emotionless mask. But Alistair, watching from above, could see the tremor in his hands, the slight quiver of his chin. He was breaking. Alistair looked around the yard, searching for another adult, another voice of authority. He saw none. He saw only the silent, watching eyes of children learning a terrible lesson. That cruelty wins, that the strong prey on the weak, and that no one will step in. The pressure inside Alistair's chest built into a physical force. It was the memory of his son's bruised cheek, the echo of Principal Thompson's dismissive voice, the sight of a lone boy being stripped of his dignity in front of the entire world. The tweed cloak of invisibility felt suffocating, a coward's garment. With a slow, deliberate movement, he set down the book he was holding. The spine made a soft, final thud on the wooden desk. He walked to the classroom door, his heart hammering a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He was no longer a ghost. He was a man walking toward a fire. Alistair Finch stepped out of the school building and into the charged atmosphere of the yard. He didn't run or shout. His steps were measured, the sound of his worn leather shoes on the pavement a quiet, inexorable beat against the backdrop of nervous whispers and cruel laughter. The sea of students parted for him, their faces a mixture of confusion and morbid curiosity. The old teacher, the dusty relic, was walking directly toward the epicenter of the school's social power. It was like watching a moth fly toward a flame. Trent saw him coming and a smirk spread across his face. This was even better than he had hoped. Well, look what we have here," he announced to his audience. "It's Professor Boring, come to give us a lecture on pronouns." Alistair didn't respond to the taunt. He stopped a few feet away, his calm gaze fixed not on Trent, but on Leo. He simply stood there, a quiet, unassuming presence that somehow altered the entire dynamic of the scene. He had placed himself between the predator and the prey. "Go back to your dusty old books, Finch," one of Trent's friends sneered. Alistair finally shifted his gaze to Trent. His voice, when it came, was not loud, but it cut through the noise with the clarity of a ringing bell. "That's enough, Trent." It was not a request. It was a statement of fact. An ending. Trent, emboldened by his audience, laughed. "Or what? You gonna hit me with your library card?" He took a step forward, puffing out his chest, using his size to intimidate. "This has nothing to do with you, old man," to punctuate his dominance. Trent reached out and shoved Alistair hard in the chest. A collective gasp went through the crowd. They expected the frail teacher to stumble, to fall. But Alistair didn't move. He absorbed the impact, his feet planted as if rooted to the earth. He didn't flinch, didn't even blink. He just held Trent's gaze, and in his eyes, for the first time, the boy saw something other than the timid academic. He saw a flicker of granite, an immovable resolve that was utterly baffling and strangely terrifying. All the fight seemed to drain out of Trent in that moment. He had used his best weapon, physical intimidation, and it had failed. Alistair broke the silence. "The boy is with me." He turned his back on Trent, a gesture of ultimate dismissal, and knelt down. He began to patiently gather Leo's scattered belongings, the book, the drawing, the pencil. He handed them to the boy, his movements gentle. Then he placed a hand on Leo's shoulder and helped him to his feet. Without another word, he began to walk Leo away from the fence, away from the silent, stunned crowd. The jeers had died in their throats, replaced by a confused, grudging silence. Alistair Finch had not thrown a punch, had not raised his voice. He had simply stood, and in doing so he had won everything. The next day, the school was a different place. The air, usually thick with the mundane anxieties of adolescence, crackled with a new energy. The video of the confrontation, shaky and poorly filmed, had made the rounds. It was an unimpressive spectacle in terms of action. A shove, a stare down, a quiet retreat. But its power was in the subtext. Everyone had seen Trent's bravado shatter against the quiet dignity of a man they had all written off. Alistair Finch was no longer invisible. As he walked the halls, the usual cacophony of student chatter would momentarily dip. Students who had never acknowledged his existence now met his eyes, their expressions a mix of awe, confusion, and for some, a flicker of shame. They saw him not as a teacher, but as a man who had done what they were all too afraid to do. He had stood up. His colleagues were no different. There were quiet nods of respect in the staff room, a thermos of coffee left on his desk by an anonymous admirer. Principal Thompson, however, was furious. He summoned Alistair to his office, his polished demeanor cracking under the strain. "What were you thinking, Alistair?" he demanded. "You undermined my authority. You created a public spectacle. Trent's father has been on the phone with me all morning. This is a disaster." Alistair simply listened, his hands clasped calmly behind his back. "I did what I felt was right, Principal Thompson," he said, his voice even. "I protected a student." The principal was momentarily silenced by the simple, unassailable truth of the statement. He dismissed Alistair with a wave of his hand, promising official repercussions, a formal review. Alistair accepted it as the inevitable cost. But the most significant shift was in Leo. The boy sought him out before first period. He didn't say thank you. He didn't have to. He just stood before Alistair's desk and placed a folded piece of paper on it. It was the drawing that had been scattered on the asphalt. It was a remarkably detailed sketch of a soaring hawk, its eyes fierce and free. It was a gift, a confession, a thank you all in one. A silent understanding passed between the old teacher and the young boy, a bond forged in a moment of shared defiance. As Alistair walked home that evening, the weight of the coming disciplinary action felt strangely light. He had acted not as a teacher, but as the man he should have been for his own son. He felt a quiet peace settle over him, the kind that comes from choosing a difficult right over an easy wrong. He had no idea that his small act of courage had sent a ripple out into the world, a signal that was about to be answered in a way no one could have ever imagined. The next morning began like any other. The sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Northgate Middle School. Teachers arrived, clutching coffee cups. Yellow buses rumbled to the curb, disgorging their noisy cargo. But then, a new sound began. It started as a low, distant hum, a vibration felt more than heard. It grew steadily, resolving itself into the unmistakable, syncopated thunder of V-twin engines. It wasn't one or two motorcycles. It was a legion. They came over the rise of the main access road, a wave of chrome and black leather that seemed to blot out the morning sun. Harley-Davidsons, hundreds of them, poured into the school's vicinity. They moved with a disciplined, intimidating grace, filling the main parking lot, then the overflow lot, then lining the streets for blocks in every direction. The sound was a physical presence, a deafening roar that shook the windows of the school and silenced every other noise. The school ground to a halt. Students flattened themselves against classroom windows, their faces pale with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. Teachers peered out, their morning announcements forgotten. Principal Thompson, his face ashen, could be seen in his office, shouting frantically into his phone. The riders dismounted. They were not the weekend warriors of suburban cul-de-sacs. These were men forged from grit and asphalt. They wore the full colors of the Hells Angels, leather vests or cuts, adorned with the iconic Death's Head patch and rockers proclaiming their charter. Their faces were maps of hard living, etched with scars and framed by formidable beards. They were mountains of men, their silence more menacing than any shout. They didn't approach the school. They simply stood by their bikes, a silent, unmovable army of 300, their collective presence a suffocating weight on the manicured peace of Northgate. At their head, standing by a gleaming black street glide, was a man who seemed carved from granite. He was immense, with a beard that flowed down his chest and arms covered in a tapestry of tattoos. This was Grizz, the president of the charter, a man whose quiet gaze held more authority than a judge's gavel. He surveyed the scene, his expression unreadable, and then, with a slow, deliberate stride, he began to walk toward the school's main entrance, the crowd of bikers parting for him like the Red Sea. The world held its breath. Alistair was in his classroom, trying to start a lesson on the Merchant of Venice, when the thunder of the engines began. He, like everyone else, went to the window. What he saw made his blood run cold. His first thought was that Trent's father had hired thugs, that this was a grotesque escalation of yesterday's events, and that he was the target. He felt a tremor of fear, but it was quickly replaced by a resigned sense of duty. He had started this, and he would face it. He walked out of his classroom and down the empty, silent hallway, his footsteps echoing in the unnatural quiet. He emerged from the main doors just as Grizz reached the bottom of the steps. The two men faced each other, a study in contrasts. The towering, leather-clad biker and the slender, tweed-clad teacher. Principal Thompson and two newly arrived, terrified-looking police officers stood uselessly on the top step, frozen in place. Grizz stopped. He looked past the principal, his eyes locking onto Alistair. His voice was a low rumble, like gravel turning in a cement mixer. "We're looking for Alistair Finch." Alistair's heart hammered. "I am Mr. Finch," he said, his voice steady despite the fear. Grizz nodded slowly, his gaze intense, searching. "And we're looking for a boy." Name's Leo. At the mention of his name, Leo, who had been hiding behind a pillar in the lobby, hesitantly stepped forward. He saw Grizz, and the fear on his face was replaced by a look of disbelief, and then a dawning, heartbreaking recognition. He whispered a single word, so quiet it was almost lost in the tense silence. "Grizz." The biker president's harsh features softened, a barely perceptible shift. He looked from Leo to Alistair and back again. He spoke to Alistair, his voice now lower, for his ears only. "Leo's father. He was one of us. His road name was Prospect. He was a good man, a brother. He went down in a wreck 2 years ago. Before he passed, he made us promise. He made us promise to look out for his kid." Grizz paused, the emotion in his throat thick. "We've been keeping our distance, letting the state do its thing. We had people checking in, quiet-like. We heard the kid was having a rough time. Then last night, one of our guys, his kid goes to this school, sent us a video." He looked directly into Alistair's eyes, and for the first time, Alistair saw not a threat, but a profound, almost solemn respect. "You stood for our brother's son. You took the heat that was meant for him. You did our job when we weren't here to do it. That's a debt we don't take lightly." The reveal hung in the air, changing everything. Leo was not just a forgotten foster kid. He was the son of a fallen angel, the ward of a brotherhood that never forgot its own. And Alistair, the quiet teacher, had unknowingly stepped into the role of his guardian. The recognition was swift and absolute. Grizz turned away from Alistair and faced the silent army of bikers spread across the school grounds. His voice, no longer a private rumble, boomed with the authority of a field commander. "This man," he shouted, pointing a thick finger at Alistair, "is Alistair Finch. Yesterday, in this yard, he stood for Prospect's boy. He faced down the coward who was hurting him. He did it alone. He showed honor." A low murmur of approval went through the crowd of bikers, a sound like a distant rockslide. It was the highest praise their culture could bestow. In a gesture that stunned the onlookers, Grizz began to unstrap his own cut. The leather vest, heavy with patches that told the story of his life. His rank, his charter, his fallen brothers, was a sacred object. He held it out to Alistair. "A man who shows that kind of honor deserves respect." Alistair, overwhelmed, shook his head and took a step back. "No, I can't. I'm just a teacher." His refusal was not one of fear, but of genuine humility. He understood the significance of the gesture and knew he had not earned that right. Grizz seemed to understand. He nodded, taking his vest back. But the symbolic act was not over. He motioned to another biker who came forward holding a small, new patch. It was a perfect, embroidered replica of the club's death's head insignia. Grizz took it and pressed it into Alistair's hand. The fabric was stiff and new. "This, then," Grizz said, his voice low again. "A mark of respect. Not membership. Recognition. From this day on, you and this boy are under the protection of this charter." "Anyone, and I mean anyone," he said, his eyes flicking for a brief, cold second toward Principal Thompson and then sweeping the yard until they landed on Trent, who had just arrived with his furious father. "Gives either of you a problem. They have a problem with all of us." The threat was unspoken but hung in the air, heavier and more real than any legal document or school policy. Trent, who had been posturing beside his father, visibly shrank, his face turning the color of chalk. His father, a man used to getting his way with bluster and donations, was utterly silent, his mouth slightly agape. He was looking at a force that his money could not touch and his influence could not bend. The balance of power at Northgate Middle School had just been permanently and irrevocably rewritten. The bikers' departure was as dramatic as their arrival. There were no speeches, no further threats. Their purpose had been achieved. On an unseen signal from Grizz, a cascade of engines roared to life. The sound was not one of anger or aggression now. It was a triumphant, deafening salute. It was the sound of a promise made and a debt honored. One by one, in a display of disciplined power, the motorcycles pulled out of the parking lots and onto the street, forming a long, shining river of chrome and steel. They rode past the school, and as each biker passed the spot where Alistair stood with Leo, they gave a slow, deliberate nod of respect. It was a procession of guardians, a parade of fierce loyalty leaving its indelible mark on the quiet suburban morning. The last bike turned the corner, and the thunder faded, leaving behind a silence that was more profound than the noise it had replaced. In the quiet, the smell of gasoline and leather hung in the air, a phantom reminder of the power that had descended and departed. Alistair looked down at the patch in his hand. It felt heavy, a token of an alliance he had never sought. Leo stood beside him, and for the first time since he had arrived at Northgate, his shoulders were back and his head was high. He was no longer a ghost. He was the son of a fallen brother, and he was not alone. Alistair placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, a gesture of quiet solidarity. Together, they turned and walked back toward the school's entrance. The students and teachers who had crowded the doors and windows parted for them in a wave of awed silence. The whispers that followed them now were not of mockery or pity, but of sheer, unadulterated respect. Principal Thompson stood by the door, his face a mask of defeated bureaucracy. Trent and his father were gone, having slipped away in the roar of the engines. Their reign was over. Later that day, in the quiet sanctuary of his classroom, Alistair Finch sat at his desk. The school had returned to a semblance of normalcy, but everything was different. The beige had been stripped from his world. He took the Hell's Angels patch from his pocket, its stark black and white a startling contrast to his tweed jacket. He opened a heavy, leather-bound edition of Shakespeare's Tragedies, a book that had been his father's, and carefully placed the patch between the pages of Hamlet. It was a secret, a symbol of an honor he had earned not in a classroom, but in a schoolyard by simply choosing to stand. The quiet man, the invisible man, was now a guardian, recognized and respected by a brotherhood of guardians. And sometimes, if he listened closely, he could almost hear the faint, comforting rumble of distant motorcycles, a permanent echo on the horizon.